There was a foil-wrapped plate sitting on my porch when I got home, still faintly warm. Turkey and rice, and my grandmother's tamarind chutney, arranged the way my mother always arranges a plate when she wants it to look thoughtful instead of like an afterthought. A paper napkin folded into a neat triangle beside a plastic fork, the kind of careful presentation that somehow made the whole thing sting worse than if she'd simply left it in a sandwich bag. Beside it, a text on my phone, sent 20 minutes earlier while I was still driving home from a shoot that ran long. Didn't want you to miss out. Sorry things got complicated with seating. We'll catch up soon. I stood on my own porch reading that sentence twice, cars passing on the street behind me, the November air sharp enough that I could see my own breath. Through the front window of my parents' house, 3 blocks away, close enough that I could have walked it in under 10 minutes. I could see the whole family still gathered around the table. My sister laughing at something, her fiancé's parents seated in the good dining chairs. My mother only brings out for company that matters. I stood there a moment longer than I probably needed to, plate in hand, watching warm yellow light spill out onto their lawn, before I turned and walked back to my car. Welcome to Sweet Payback Stories. Tonight's story begins with a plate left on a porch and ends with a family finding out exactly how much they'd quietly built on top of something that was never actually theirs to use. My name is Preya Anand. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a recipe developer and food writer, the kind of career that started, if I trace it back honestly, in my grandmother Mira's kitchen, standing on a step stool beside her stove, before I was even tall enough to see over the counter without one. I want you to hold on to that detail, because everything that unraveled over the following months traced directly back to her, to a woman who died 4 years ago and left behind, among other things, a leather-bound recipe journal. I thought, until recently, I understood completely. That Thanksgiving porch plate wasn't actually the beginning of anything, if I'm honest. It was simply the moment I finally stopped explaining it away. I sat down on my own front steps that evening, plate balanced on my knees, and started scrolling back through old text threads, and found, without much effort at all, that some version of this exact excuse had happened at 3 of the last 5 family gatherings. A seating issue at Easter, a scheduling mix-up that meant I got a phone call instead of an invitation to my uncle's retirement dinner. Always framed the same way, things getting complicated, always delivered with just enough warmth to make questioning it feel petty. I ate that cold turkey alone in my kitchen that night, and something in me, some low patient thing I hadn't fully named yet, decided I was done accepting the warmth as an explanation for the absence. I need to back up further though, because you have to understand my grandmother before you understand what actually happened here. Mira Anand ran a small Indian restaurant with my grandfather for almost 30 years. A modest, beloved place in a strip mall that most of the neighborhood still talks about fondly, even though it closed not long after he passed. I remember being small enough to sit on an overturned crate in the corner of that kitchen, watching her move between pots with a kind of unhurried certainty I've spent my whole adult career trying to imitate. She cooked from instinct more than measurement for most of her life. A pinch of this, a fistful of that. Never once writing anything down because it lived entirely in her hands. It was only in her later years, slowing down, aware, in the specific way older people sometimes become aware of their own mortality, that she started writing everything down properly. In a leather journal with a cracked spine she kept on the kitchen counter, recipes in her careful looping handwriting, along with little notes in the margins about who in the family loved which dish and why. Priya likes extra ginger, reads one note beside a dal recipe dated the year I turned 22. Doesn't know why yet. She will. I spent countless afternoons in that kitchen with her during those years, the two of us cooking side by side while she narrated the recipes into that journal, her voice slow and deliberate in a way it never was for casual conversation, like she understood these particular words needed to survive her. Somewhere along the way, without either of us fully naming it out loud, I understood I was the one she was actually writing it for. When she died 4 years ago, the will named me specifically as the recipient of that journal, along with, in her attorney's exact careful language, all rights to its contents, to use and share as she sees fit. I kept a copy of that document in a keepsake box in my closet, filed away alongside her old apron and a few photographs. Not because I expected to ever need it, but because it felt, in some small way, like still having her voice in the house. The physical journal itself, though, wasn't actually with me. About 3 years ago, my mother asked to borrow it, just to scan a few pages for a family project she was vague about at the time. Something about putting together a memory book for my grandfather's anniversary, she said. I handed it over without a second thought, the way you hand things to your own mother without imagining there could ever be a reason not to. I never got it back. I never thought to ask for it back either, if I'm being fully honest, the way you don't think to ask for something you've never once imagined being used against you. The first crack in that comfortable assumption came almost by accident, weeks after that Thanksgiving plate, at a work event where a former coworker congratulated me warmly in passing on the family cookbook, clearly assuming I already knew every detail of it. I remember the specific disorienting feeling of smiling and nodding along to a conversation I had absolutely no context for, asking careful, vague follow-up questions until I understood enough to go home and search it myself. A regional publisher, a modest but real one, had released a cookbook 4 months earlier, built entirely around my grandmother's recipes, titled simply Mira's Table, on shelves in 3 states by then, doing well enough to have earned a small but genuine following online. I bought a copy that same afternoon, sitting in my car in the parking lot instead of waiting until I got home, flipping through it with my hands not quite steady. The recipes were unmistakably hers. I could trace the handwriting style in the reproduced margin notes. The specific ingredient substitutions I remembered her explaining to me directly. The exact phrasing she used for measuring spices by feel, rather than precise amounts. I turned to the credit page, expecting at minimum to find my own name somewhere in the acknowledgments. It read only, "Lovingly preserved by the Anan family." My name appeared nowhere in that entire book, not on the cover, not in the introduction, not in a single line of the acknowledgments, despite the fact that I was the one legally named to inherit exactly this material. I sat in that parking lot for a long time, the book open in my lap, feeling something shift inside me that I didn't yet have words for. It wasn't simply about credit, though the credit mattered plenty on its own. It was the specific disorienting realization that an entire project involving my grandmother's legacy had been planned, developed, and published over the course of what must have been well over a year, all while I sat 3 blocks away being handed cold plates on my own front porch. I called my cousin Angeli that evening, the one person in the family I still trusted completely, pacing my small kitchen while the phone rang, and she was as surprised as I was, her voice going sharp with disbelief when I read her the credit page over the phone. "Wait, Lovingly preserved by the Anand family? That's it? Nothing with your actual name on it? She was quiet for a second, and then said more carefully, Priya, I think I might have seen something about this months ago. Give me a second. I heard her typing on the other end, the sound of a laptop keyboard, and then a long pause. There's a folder, she said slowly, in the shared family cloud drive. I always just assumed it was planning documents for some kind of memorial project. Honestly, I never opened half of it. She dug it up for me while we were still on the phone reading file names out loud, her voice getting quieter with each one. Priya, there's a whole contract in here. What she found reframed the entire timeline. A formal licensing agreement dated over a year earlier between my parents and the publisher, representing themselves in the contract's own language as authorized signatories on behalf of the estate of Meera Anand, an estate that had legally already closed, an estate whose named beneficiary for exactly this material was me, and had been for 4 years, sitting quietly in a folder in my closet the entire time. I'm so sorry, Anjali kept saying over and over, like she'd personally done something wrong just by having access to the folder. I told her it wasn't her fault. I don't think either of us fully believed it made either of us feel any better. What the licensing agreement also revealed once Anjali forwarded me the full folder was the money. The advance had been substantial, more than I expected for a regional cookbook release, and the ongoing royalty structure, modest per unit but building steadily as the book kept selling, had already generated a real, meaningful sum over 4 months. Buried in an email thread inside that same folder, a message from my mother to my father, casual, unguarded, mentioned using the book money to help cover the deposit on my sister's wedding reception venue, a detail nobody in the family had ever openly connected to the cookbook, because nobody outside my parents had known the cookbook's origins were anything other than a loving tribute everyone had simply, somehow, forgotten to tell me about. I want to be honest about how I felt reading that email. It wasn't rage exactly, not yet. It was a colder, more specific kind of hurt, watching a project built on my inheritance quietly fund the celebration I was, at that point, still fully expected to attend and smile through. An aunt let something slip a few weeks later, at a smaller family gathering I did get invited to, mentioning offhand that a regional morning show had taped a cooking segment featuring the Anand family cookbook that would be airing that same holiday weekend, the specific weekend of the plate left on my porch. I sat with that detail for a long time afterward, doing the math, understanding finally why that particular Thanksgiving had needed me kept just slightly at arm's length. It wasn't random discomfort, it was timing. Nobody wanted me asking pointed questions about a book I didn't know existed in the days before it appeared on regional television. I went looking through my own old photos after that conversation, mostly out of a need to feel some kind of ground under my feet again, and found something I'd completely forgotten about. Years earlier, before my grandmother died, I'd photographed several pages of that journal myself, intending to write a personal food blog post about her recipes that I never actually got around to publishing. The photos were still there, time-stamped, dated well over a year before the publishing deal my parents signed. Quiet, accidental proof of my own long, direct relationship with that material, sitting untouched in my camera roll the entire time. I consulted an intellectual property attorney the following week, a careful, unhurried woman named Farah, who specializes in exactly this kind of family and estate dispute. More common, she told me, sliding my grandmother's will across her desk, to compare against the licensing agreement than most people would ever guess. Families think probate is something that just finishes itself once the big items get handled, she said, flipping through pages, glasses pushed up on her forehead. Specialty assets like this, intellectual property, recipes, unpublished manuscripts, they get missed constantly, not usually out of malice, just exhaustion. She reviewed the will, the licensing agreement, my grandmother's original death certificate and probate filing, cross-referencing dates for a long silent stretch, while I sat across from her trying not to fidget. "Here's your answer," she finally said, tapping a specific page. The physical journal and its associated rights, she explained, had never actually been formally transferred through probate at all. My grandmother's will named me, clearly and specifically, but the actual administrative step of transferring that specific asset, the intellectual property itself, had simply never been completed. An oversight, Farah suspected, born more of a busy, overwhelmed family, managing a death than any deliberate scheme at the time. "Which means," she said, closing the folder, "functionally, your parents' authority to license anything to that publisher rested on legal ground that is at best deeply uncertain, at worst it never existed at all." Farah sent formal notice to the publisher the following week, laying out the rights dispute plainly, professionally, without accusation, simply establishing the facts as they stood. The publisher's response came back within days, cautious and immediate. They paused all further plans, a second printing that had apparently been in early discussion, a possible companion spice line they'd been quietly developing with my parents. Everything on hold pending resolution, unwilling to risk building further business on top of disputed intellectual property. My sister found out during all of this too, and I want to be fair to her because she wasn't part of the deception in any active way. Confronting our parents together at my insistence, sitting side by side on the same worn couch we'd shared 100 childhood movie nights on, she learned for the first time that part of her own wedding budget traced directly back to a deal built on a legal gap nobody had disclosed to her either. "Wait," she said, sitting forward slowly, looking between our parents. "The venue deposit, that was from the cookbook?" Our mother nodded, and I watched my sister's face change in real time. Watched her realize how much had been quietly arranged around her, around both of us really, without either of us having the full picture. "You let me think that was from your savings," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "You let me thank you for something that wasn't even yours to give." Our mother didn't have an answer for that either. Our mother's explanation, when it finally came, wasn't the cold, calculated confession I'd half braced myself for. She sat us both down at that same kitchen table I'd eaten at my entire childhood, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never once drank from, and admitted, her voice tight, that the family restaurant she and my father still ran had been struggling quietly for nearly 2 years. A slow decline neither of them had wanted to worry us with. "You girls have your own lives," she said. "I didn't want you carrying our problems on top of everything else." "So instead you carry mine," I said, and immediately regretted how sharp it came out, though I didn't take it back. She flinched but kept going. "The cookbook deal. When the publisher first approached them after seeing a local feature about my grandmother's old restaurant, felt like the one genuine lifeline available to them," she explained. "An offer that arrived at exactly the moment they needed it most. I worried if I brought you into it, Priya, it would get complicated," she said, not quite meeting my eyes, turning the mug slowly in her hands. lawyers, and rights, and who owns what. I told myself I was protecting the money we needed, not taking something from you. My sister beside me had gone very quiet, watching our mother with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between anger and a kind of reluctant understanding. I didn't fully accept our mother's explanation. I also didn't fully reject it either. Fear and greed, I've come to understand, don't always announce themselves as separate things. I made a decision after that conversation that surprised even me a little. Rather than pursuing damages, the kind of aggressive legal path Farah told me I genuinely had standing to take, I negotiated instead for formal, permanent credit in all future editions of the book, a fair, ongoing share of the royalties going forward, and I directed my own portion of that money, once it started coming to me properly, into a small culinary scholarship fund established in my grandmother's name at a local community college, rather than keeping it for myself. I didn't want to financially cripple a struggling restaurant that had, whatever else was true, started this whole thing out of real desperation rather than pure malice. I wanted the record corrected. I didn't need anyone punished to feel like that had actually happened. This year's Thanksgiving looked different from everyone before it. I didn't go to my parents' table. I hosted my own small Friendsgiving instead in my own apartment, cooking several dishes adapted carefully from my grandmother's actual journal, credited properly this time on the handwritten menu cards I set at each place setting, her name and mine both, exactly the way it always should have been. My sister showed up early to help me cook, hours before anyone else arrived, still in her coat when she walked in, holding a bottle of wine and looking uncertain about whether she was actually welcome. She was. The two of us stood shoulder to shoulder at my stove the way I used to stand with our grandmother, the kitchen filling with the smell of toasted cumin and simmering dal, and somewhere in the middle of chopping cilantro and arguing gently about how much cumin the recipe actually called for. The same argument, I realized halfway through it, our grandmother used to have with both of us separately. We had the first real, honest conversation the two of us had managed in years, unfolding quietly over a stove instead of at a table where I'd once been left out entirely. I think about that porch plate sometimes, foil still warm. The specific loneliness of eating a holiday dinner alone in my own kitchen while my family sat 3 blocks away. I don't think about it with the same sharp hurt anymore. I think about it as the exact moment I finally stopped accepting complicated as an explanation for anything and started asking instead, complicated for whom and why? If there's a piece of your own family's legacy that's been quietly used without your full knowledge, a story, a recipe, a name, something that was always meant to be yours to carry forward, I hope this reminds you that patience and documentation can still eventually set the record straight. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one in the comments. And if you believe truth and quiet correction can outlast even a carefully managed family narrative, stay close, because Sweet Payback Stories has another one waiting for you very soon.